Genesis chapter 6. 11 verses that have sparked more debate, more speculation, and more wild theories than almost any other passage in Scripture. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. 11 verses. And for thousands of years people have asked, who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? Were they giants? Were they fallen angels? Were they hybrid creatures? And why does this matter? Today I'm going to show you what the Bible actually says, what it doesn't say, and why this passage is far more important to the story of redemption than most Christians realize. This isn't ancient aliens. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is careful examination of Scripture, ancient Hebrew, Jewish tradition, and what the New Testament reveals. And what we find is both stranger and more theologically significant than you think. Let me read you the full passage. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." And then immediately, verse 5, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Read that progression. Something happened involving the sons of God and the daughters of humans. The Nephilim appeared, and immediately after, the wickedness of humanity reaches a point where God decides to flood the earth. This isn't random, it's connected. So let's start with the most controversial question. Who are the sons of God? In Hebrew, the phrase is Bene Elohim, and here's where it gets interesting. In the Old Testament, this exact phrase appears in only a few places. Job 1-6, Job 2-1, Job 38-7. And in every single one of those contexts, it refers to angelic beings. In Job 1-6, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. These are clearly not humans. They're spiritual beings in the heavenly court. In Job 38-7, God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" This is before humanity existed. The sons of God are angels witnessing creation. So when Genesis 6 uses the exact same phrase, Bene Elohim, the most straightforward reading, based on how the phrase is used everywhere else in the Old Testament, is that it's referring to angelic beings, not humans, angels. And this interpretation isn't modern, it's ancient. The earliest Jewish interpretations, including the Book of Enoch, which was widely read in the Second Temple period, and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, both understood it this way. Angels, specifically fallen angels, came to earth, took human women, and produced offspring. The Nephilim? Now, I know what you're thinking. Angels can't have physical bodies. They can't reproduce. And that's a valid theological concern. But let's look at what Scripture actually says. In Genesis 18, 3 angels appear to Abraham. They eat food, they walk, they speak, they have physical form. In Genesis 19, 2 angels go to Sodom. The men of the city want to have sexual relations with them. which implies the angels had bodies that could be perceived as male. Hebrews 13:2 says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Angels can take physical form. The question isn't whether they can. The question is whether they did in Genesis 6 in a way that violated God's created order. And here's where Jude and 2 Peter come in. Jude, verse 6. "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, God has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." What did these angels do? They abandoned their proper dwelling. They left their assigned place. And 2 Peter 2-4 says something similar. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into chains of darkness to be held for judgment. Peter then immediately references Noah and the flood in the next verse. The connection is clear. Certain angels sinned in a specific, catastrophic way before the flood, and they're now imprisoned, awaiting final judgment. This is different from Satan and demons, who are still active. These specific angels are bound. Why? What did they do that was so severe? The most consistent interpretation, held by the early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, is that these are the angels from Genesis 6. They crossed a boundary. They took human women. They produced offspring. And God responded with the flood and with permanent imprisonment for those angels. This isn't speculation. This is connecting Scripture to Scripture. Now, let's talk about the Nephilim. The Hebrew word Nephilim is difficult to translate. It comes from the root naphal, which means to fall. Some translate it as fallen ones, others as giants, because later in Scripture, the Nephilim are described as being large. In Numbers 13:33, when the Israelite spies scout out the promised land, they report, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." These were huge people, intimidating, terrifying, and the spies connect them to the Nephilim from before the flood. But here's the question. If the Nephilim were wiped out in the flood, how were they in Canaan centuries later? Genesis 6-4 actually gives us a clue. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Also afterward. After what? After the flood. This suggests that whatever caused the Nephilim to appear before the flood happened again after the flood. Some believe this means a second incursion of fallen angels. Others believe it means the genetic corruption continued through Noah's sons' wives or through Ham's line, which might explain why God commands the Israelites to completely destroy certain Canaanite peoples, including the descendants of Anak. This is deeply uncomfortable. But if those peoples carried genetic corruption from the angelic-human hybridization, God's command to wipe them out wasn't genocide. It was protecting the human bloodline through which the Messiah would come. And this brings us to why this matters. Because Genesis 6 isn't just a weird story about giants. It's about spiritual warfare. It's about Satan's attempt to corrupt the human race so thoroughly that the promised seed, the Messiah, couldn't come. Genesis 3:15 is the first prophecy of Christ. God tells the serpent, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. The offspring of the woman will defeat the serpent." If Satan could corrupt humanity genetically through angelic-human hybridization, then that prophecy couldn't be fulfilled. The Messiah couldn't come through a pure human line. That's why the flood happened. Genesis 6-9 says, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. The Hebrew word for blameless is tamim, which can mean morally blameless, but also means complete, whole, unblemished. It's the same word used for sacrificial animals that had to be without defect. Noah's genealogy is emphasized. Genesis 6:9. This is the account of Noah and his family. His line was uncorrupted, his genetics were fully human, and through him humanity could be preserved and the Messiah could eventually come. This is spiritual warfare on a cosmic scale, and it didn't stop after the flood. When the Israelites enter Canaan, they encounter giants again. Og, king of Bashan, whose bed was 13 feet long. Goliath, over 9 feet tall. The sons of Anak. These weren't just big people. They were remnants of the Nephilim corruption. And God commanded their destruction, not out of cruelty, but to protect the bloodline of the Messiah. Every battle against giants in the Old Testament is part of the larger war to preserve humanity, so that Jesus could be born fully human, fully God, and crush the serpent's head. Now, let's address the alternative interpretation, because it's important to be fair. Some Christians argue that the sons of God in Genesis 6 aren't angels, but rather the godly line of Seth, Adam's son. And the daughters of humans are the ungodly line of Cain. So the sin is believers marrying unbelievers. This interpretation became popular in the 5th century with Augustine, partly because he was uncomfortable with the idea of angels having relations with humans. And many modern evangelical scholars hold this view. But here's the problem. If it's just humans marrying humans, why does it produce Nephilim, who are described as giants and mighty warriors? Why would human intermarriage between two human lines produce offspring that are abnormally large and powerful? And why would this specific sin warrant the complete destruction of the world by flood? Humanity had already been sinful since the fall. Cain murdered Abel. Violence and wickedness were already present. What makes this particular sin in Genesis 6 so catastrophic that God says, "I regret that I have made them"? The angelic interpretation makes sense of the severity. It wasn't just human sin. It was a corruption of humanity itself, a violation of the created order, an attempt by fallen angels to make humanity unredeemable. And God responded with the flood to reset creation, preserving only the one family whose line was still fully human. And here's the other issue with the Sethite view. Nowhere else in Scripture is the phrase sons of God used to mean godly humans. It's always angels. To suddenly make it mean something different in Genesis 6, without any textual indication, is reading into the text what we want it to say, because we're uncomfortable with what it actually says. Now, does this mean I think there are alien-human hybrids walking around today? No. The specific event of Genesis 6, where angels took human women, seems to have resulted in those angels being permanently bound, according to Jude and 2 Peter. They can't do it again. But the spiritual warfare continues. Ephesians 6:12 says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." The battle didn't end. It's still happening, just in different forms. And here's the application for us. Genesis 6 reminds us that there is a real enemy, a real devil, real fallen angels. And their goal is still the same: to corrupt, to destroy, to prevent God's purposes. But they've already lost. Jesus came, fully human, fully God, born of a woman, from the uncorrupted line of humanity. He lived a sinless life. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead, and he crushed the serpent's head. Colossians 2:15 says, "Having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. The war is won, the enemy is defeated." We're just living in the cleanup phase. So when you read Genesis 6, don't just see it as a weird story about giants. See it as part of the larger story of redemption. See it as Satan's attempt to stop the Messiah from coming. And see it as God's faithfulness to preserve a remnant, to protect the promise, and to ensure that Jesus could come and save us. The Nephilim weren't just ancient history. They were part of the cosmic battle between good and evil. And we win because Jesus already won. If this opened your eyes to spiritual warfare and God's faithfulness to protect his promises, share it. And remember, the battle is real, but the victory is already ours.